Let's go to Staten Island, New York, and speak to Tom O'Connor, senior foreign policy writer at Newsweek magazine. Tom, thank you so much indeed for your time. I'm hearing increasingly the take that, hey, you know what? NATO doesn't actually have a plan. It's scrambling.
Yeah, I think that the Russians have very much made their position clear on this issue. And I think that, one of the key things here is that Ukraine obviously currently is not a NATO ally. So while NATO certainly is giving commitments, U.S. is offering its commitments to security of Ukraine, at the end of the day, there is no mandate to come to Ukraine's defense militarily. And that much has been made clear both by NATO forces and especially by the U.S. So as so much as there's a plan, we've heard packages of sanctions being unveiled when it comes to, and some as severe as to hit Vladimir Putin himself, perhaps. But at the end of the day, I think that the plan right now is limited to that. It's not going to the military sphere. And I think the Russians read that very clearly. They read that this is an issue so urgent to Russia that they're willing to build 100,000 troops on the border. They're willing to resort to other measures, whereas it's not as pressing of a concern for the U.S. and NATO side.
Yeah, I mean, Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin have already said that if the sanctions are as severe as the West is threatening, it could lead to a complete rupture of relations. What do you know about possibly the Nord Stream 2 pipeline being included in those potential sanctions? That is critical, not only for Russia, but also, of course, for Western Europe, because that gas will come from Russia and supply Western European homes. And we know what's happening with gas prices around the world. In Europe, they've been skyrocketing.
Yeah, but there's also been a disunity, I think, in Europe about this Ukraine crisis and about Russia in general. Obviously, as far as the NATO alliance and the EU states form united political entities, there is agreement and consensus among them. But at the same time, we've seen Germany not willing to really want to engage so aggressively on this Ukraine issue. Obviously, Nord Stream is very important to Germany as well. I think that is a very important point to highlight as far as these sanctions go. When it comes to the relations between U.S. and Russia, how that could be affected by this as well that you mentioned, it's very important that that statement was brought up because, I mean, these are relations that have gone on unbroken for nearly a century now, since 1933, I believe, and it's weathered crises throughout the Cold War, obviously World War II before it, the fall of the Soviet Union. The fact that that's even being mentioned right now shows how severe Russia views this issue as far as there being sanctions on Vladimir Putin himself. I think there's only about 7 other world leaders right now that are subject to U.S. sanctions. And to put Putin on that list will be a severe escalation. And both the U.S. and Russia are aware of that.
Tom, have a listen to this clip, okay, and then give us some thoughts about it. It's the Prime Minister of Latvia who says he doesn't actually believe that NATO is necessarily Russia's big issue, that it's not necessarily military security. He's got this take.
It's that the threat, the true threat that the Kremlin feels is the threat of Ukrainian democracy spreading into Russia itself. As we know, democracy is very contagious because it means the people decide, not the autocrat decides, who rules, what direction the country goes. We know this is Latvia, the value of democracy. Poland knows this as well. We have lived under a system where our people, we did not have the choice over our own destinies.
Tom, what do you make of that? Is there some truth in that, do you think?
Well, I think certainly when it comes to systems of government and the allegiances and the alignments of the governments that are in these countries, which is the post-Soviet sphere of influence, certainly Russia views that as a threat. Ukraine, of course, is at the heart of this crisis, but as has been discussed before, the broader questions here are of Eastern European security architecture and Russia viewing its historic sphere of influence being somewhat encroached upon by the NATO alliance over the past 30 years or so. And it's important to remember that a lot of these agreements and the consensus that we understand to sort of be the rules of the road right now in Eastern Europe were drawn at a time when Russia viewed itself as weak. It was after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now Russia, especially after the 20 years of Vladimir Putin, views itself as a rising power, while the U.S. still views it as declining power. And I think that there's a want from the Russian side to want to reassert itself and say, no, we're strong now. We want to rewrite these rules so that it suits our our interests, and now we're strong enough to be able to back that. So I think that certainly any sort of view of this encroachment, and whether it's democracy, whether it's missile systems, I think Russia views them both in a sense as a threat to its view of its backyard, and I think that is really the core of the question here. So while there's certainly some different treaties being put out there, and there's various proposals, some points the U.S. could compromise on, some it says it won't compromise on. I think the core nature of this is, can Russia defend its sphere of influence in of course the Kremlin's mind?
Tom, we always appreciate the analysis. Thank you so much indeed. From Newsweek, Tom O'Connor.